Can iron help solve climate change? Well, probably not on its own, but it is being looked at again for helping with climate change, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. We'll also be talking today about how a rare disappeared mole, a golden mole, was refound. We'll be talking about redwoods and their recoveries from fire, and then wrapping up the show today with some conservation topic about butterflies in Japan and how their survival relies on humans. This is Eco Show. Hello and welcome to Eco Show. I'm Henry, and this is a show about ecology, the environment, and news generally happening in that space. We'll talk about some news at the start of the show, then we talk about some research and some other things a little later on, along with some submissions that people have written in stuff. We'll talk about that at the end of the show. But to start the show today, we're talking about our iron and how it can be used to help fight climate change. And so the way that iron is used to help fight climate change is through something called ocean fertilization. And what this is doing is it puts nutrients into the ocean that spur photosynthesis. So there's a lot of organisms at the top of the ocean that use sunlight and take in carbon dioxide, which is causing climate change. And there's some idea that if you put iron in, that this can help to sequester more carbon. And the reason for this is that in different parts of the ocean, they're limiting nutrients. So in some places there will be nitrogen, in some places there will be phosphorus, and those nutrients are the things that are lacking the most. So if you put in more of a particular nutrient, you'll cause the growth of more of these organisms. So there's this idea that in areas that are deprived of iron, because iron is something that's relied upon by some of these photosynthesizing organisms, that if you put in iron into the ocean, that it will help grow these things and it'll help with climate change. But it's people have debated about it a lot, and there's some questionable environmental impacts, not only just from dumping a whole bunch of iron into the ocean, but there's not a great understanding of if you put a whole bunch of iron into a particular area of the ocean, causing these little plankton organisms to grow a bunch, then once that happens, is that going to deprive another area of the ocean down the line of some nutrients? Because there's currents that are moving nutrients all the way around through the ocean. So if you stimulate growth in one area, are you just causing down the line for there to be less growth? So in the end, is it just going to equal out? So that's been some of the critique of this idea. But there's been a recent big funding at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, which is pretty much the main. There's two really big oceanography research places. Woods Hole and Scripps are pretty much the two main big ones in the U.S. So they just got $2 million to do some computer monitoring to explore the impacts of this, because it had been picked up, and even some private companies were kind of wanting to do this. Were wanting to dump iron in the ocean, and so it had gotten a bit controversial, and it's kind of been out of the news for a while now, but they have just gotten this recent funding, so they'll be looking at it again. And the last time that they tried to do this, because they want to see how is this going to impact the growth of phytoplankton being those plankton that are at the surface of the ocean that are using sunlight and carbon dioxide, which causes climate change to grow. So last time they did this, a lot of it was just eaten at the surface. So you have all these photosynthetic organisms that are growing, but then you have a lot of other small organisms that eat those, and so then they just ate it. So when they looked at what the impact was of it, it just looked like it stayed in the surface there. And so the idea of wanting to do this is that you'll cause a bloom in phytoplankton, and they're going to grow, and then they'll die, and they'll carry that carbon down with them into deep water, and that would sequester the carbon. That's the idea. So last time they tried this, it looked like it was just eaten at the surface, which means that that carbon dioxide stayed in the surface waters and then would have been released back out of the water at some point, or at least not as sequestered as deeply or for as long a period of time. So, and that's pretty much that. So they're going to do a bunch of modeling. They've got some funding to do it. So there's some serious interest in running this, and this modeling can, ideally hopefully show what will happen in terms of a localized area, and how can you use iron fertilization to grow a phytoplankton population and not have it be eaten up and allowing it to sink down, as well as how can you do this in such a way that it's not depriving another area of ocean of nutrients. Because say you put in a bunch of iron, these phytoplankton are going to be using other nutrients that they need, like nitrogen and phosphorus. It's like your like Miracle Grow or any of those plant grow things. Those are usually some sort of fertilizer. So if you're putting in more iron, then as they're growing, they're still going to be using these other things, the nitrogen and phosphorus. And so as they're using those things, it could be possible that then they're depriving downstream or in other parts of the ocean, depriving other parts of nitrogen and phosphorus or things like that they need. So this modeling will sort of look into that. So is iron going to solve climate change? Probably not. We need to do that. There are a lot of things that we can do to solve it, but it's interesting to have this research going on, but it's important not to get too distracted by the research. There's definitely a lot of things having to do with consumption that are important to focus on for helping with climate change. And we just had the Conference of Parties, the COP, I think it might have been 28 now, which was very controversial because I think it was being run by the United Arab Emirates, possibly, or some other country very invested in oil, and they stopped there being a sort of a resolution at the end to say that that countries will agree to get rid of fossil fuels. They sort of changed the wording so that it ended up being like countries agree to kind of start to use less. So it ended up being a pretty weak agreement, and I think people aren't really looking to the Conference of Parties really anymore to get much hope from it, because there's such a huge number of big companies that are there that are invested in it. So I think initially the Conference of Parties was intended to be bringing people together and trying to find solutions, but I think very quickly it got a lot of representatives from industry, and so it's been really difficult to get very many resolutions passed that are actually trying to make some big headways in climate change. So we're in a little bit of a standstill at the moment, especially with where the economy has been at, global economy. People kind of just want to get things grooving again and have not been kind of ignoring climate change. But it's there, it's happening. You can't run away from it. Okay, so our next little piece of news today is this rediscovery of a golden mole. This is called De Winton's golden mole, and it's in South Africa. It was last documented there in 1936. and there were thought to be no physical specimens left, so they couldn't train dogs to smell it and find it. But there are other golden moles, so they trained sniffing dogs with these other golden moles to try and find this mole. And they live in sand dunes, which are constantly changing and blowing over, so it's hard to look for tracks or things like that. But they found it because there was a rainy day and tracks from this golden mole had been left, and they had the dogs out. And interestingly enough, the dog didn't react to the tracks, so that kind of told them, oh, okay, well, it's not reacting to the scent coming from these tracks, but so that means it's something that hasn't smelled before. But how do you identify it is sort of the next question that they had. So they collected a whole bunch of these tracks from the sand. So they just took a whole bunch of sand and they did DNA analysis on that. So they're able to get sequence the sand to get DNA information from that sand, and they could compare it to other related mole species, and they found that it was closely related to other rare moles. And then by some chance a specimen was found in an old museum, so they could compare these DNA sand samples to a specimen of this De Winton's golden mole, and they found that it was indeed a match. So cool little story there. And sometimes finding these things they're sort of like, the chances of finding these things are so low, and then you have this museum that just happens to find it. So this is a cute little discovery. And they're pointing out in this article that there's a lot of species like this that are under threat, that are being that are getting more rare, and they're not as charismatic necessarily. So good to have a little success there. A good wee success for this good little golden owl that doesn't have any eyes. I think they said it doesn't have any eyes, and it just uses its nose, I believe, to sniff around, and it pretty much just lives under the sand and almost has a coat that's such that it's able to swim through the sand. Okay, our next little piece of news here, we've got redwood trees recovering from fires in California. So there were these big fires in California. In this article, I don't think it said which ones there were, but California's had so many devastating fires lately that you could probably just throw a dart in a wall and it would probably be would be that one. But anyway, so they had these big fires, and the issue, redwoods are pretty well built to deal with fires, but these fires reach all the way to the crowns of the trees, and it's generally thought if the fires reach to the crown of the tree, that will kill it. And so people were pretty freaked out for these, because some of these redwoods were up to 2,000 years old, which is mind-blowing to me. But they found that they started to sprout. After a few weeks, there were sprouts coming from the bases of these redwood trees. And so they did a little bit of exploration on how this sprouting could have happened. And they found that there was energy stored in the roots of these trees, which is understandable. But the interesting thing that they found is, so they got samples of these roots, and they can see how long ago the carbon in these sugars for this energy was stored in the roots. They could see how long ago it was stored. And in some cases, it was produced as storage up to 20 years ago. So these redwoods are really have just got some great infrastructure to deal with fires and different things happening from this sort of sort of preparation. So pretty funky, cool, magical trees doing their thing. And this is one of those things that it's important, and there's starting to be more acknowledgement of what we have to do for fires. And there's been a really successful fire suppression campaign, particularly in the US and Canada, over the past 100 years or so. But it's been too successful to the extent where a lot of these ecosystems rely on intermittent fires to come through and just burn through little bits of scrub and things like that and lower branches. But when you have over time fire's been suppressed so much, you've got all of this fuel that's just there waiting to be burned up, and then you have lower levels of these trees that have never experienced fire, so you've got lower branches that can just transfer these the fire all the way up to the crowns of these trees. So it's still devastating to see the damage that's happened to these trees, and they're definitely is going to take a long time to recover, surely, from these roots. I don't think they'll be able to continue growing as they were from the existing part of the tree, but it's still good to see that they are recovering. Okay, and a little segue now to shout out the show. If you could maybe listening to the show on Spotify, or you could be watching it on Facebook or YouTube. Any of these places you could be experiencing the show, and there's probably another place you could be experiencing if you wanted to. So on YouTube and Facebook, we've got the visual version of the show where we'll have up some photos and things like that, and then Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all those places. We have got the show, so you can take it on the go. And the main sort of hub at the moment is Instagram, so that's the place where I'll post most of the things about the show. I'll put up polls or questions and things like that for you to answer about the show. So, but you can interact on it anywhere. Anywhere is very welcome. And thanks for checking out the show. So that's the segue for the show. The Instagram handle and the name for that you can find this on all the places is Henry from Nature. And on Instagram, I've got links to all the other pages if you want to go interact with the pages in other places. Thanks. Okay, now for our main big kind of article for the show today. We have a cool situation that's going on in Japan. Well, I guess it's not super cool because there's a blue butterfly species that is declining, but the conservation of the species is pretty unique in the conditions that it requires. And what's happening is that there are grasslands that are declining due to urbanization. So a lot of people moving into cities. You've got a lot of agricultural areas that are reverting into forest sort of settings, which generally is something that we would associate with being a pretty good thing. But there's been pastoral use of the landscape in Japan for so long that this butterfly actually sort of relies on these mixed-use landscapes that have grasslands and forest and farmland all in it. This traditional landscape is called Satoyama, and it has woodland, grassland, farm, and rice fields. And now University of Tokyo researchers have connected with a town to explore how they can conserve the butterfly species, and they're doing an agricultural cooperative to maintain the landscape, and they're reintroducing this rare butterfly there. So another issue with the changes in agriculture is that you have a lot of agriculture switching to using pesticides and herbicides and things like that, as well as a lot of monoculture crops that can really homogenize the landscape, and those have been shown to not be good for diversity of insect species. They're looking to roll out more sort of programs like this that can stop this reversion from happening, or this switching of having the forest just all come back. And it looks like some butterflies are already coming back. So I thought this was cool just because usually you're used to hearing, and especially because I do restoration stuff, usually people are wanting to bring back the forest, especially in places that have not had a long history of forest being gone from there. But it makes sense in a place like Japan, where you have thousands of years of people using the landscape, and so the animals and insects being fairly adapted to that it would be required for you to have this sort of different sort of landscape going on. And it ties into this important idea and this important question of what it means to conserve habitat and conserve landscapes and ecosystems and things like this, because we have this idea, at least in the United States, that a pristine ecosystem should not have humans in it, but that's tied in a lot of colonial views, and oftentimes, especially in the U.S., many of our national parks had people living there, and they were important places to indigenous people, but the people were moved off of that land, and then they were presented as some sort of pristine space without humans. But in many cases, we see lots of issues come out when we take humans out of the landscape and take away the ways that they've been interacting with the landscape for thousands of years, because all these systems have learned to coordinate and work with each other in a good way to the best of their ability. So cool to see this sort of situation, and hopefully continue to see more of these sorts of things come back, this sort of mixed-use landscape, which I imagine there could be similar things going on in Europe, because they have this sort of a similar historical situation there, where you have a bit of agriculture that's been going on for quite some time, and a pretty mixed-use landscapes going on. So that's all of our topics for this week, and this was episode 50. So thank you for listening and for sticking around for all these episodes. Looking forward to a new year of episodes coming through, and wishing you all the best. So I hope you have I don't know if I'll publish this before or after the holidays, but if it's after, then I hope you had a good holidays, and if it's before, then I hope your holidays are good, and we'll catch you soon. Bye bye.